everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Timeless Wealth Podcast. I have with me Amy Dietz-Graham and Jalal Madani. My name is Durkin. We read a lot of books from time to time. I think I read somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 books. I tend to rotate between a fiction book, crime fiction novel, and then a fiction book. They tend to be business related. I know, Jalal, you read even more than that. You're quite the voracious reader. You read a lot, yeah. And so are you. And, we were having a conversation a little while ago, and we thought maybe it'd be interesting to share some of the books that we read with our listeners and our viewers and our thoughts on them, and leave it to you if whether or not you want to read them yourselves. And the first book we looked at is a book called The Psychology of Money, written by one Morgan Housel. It's published by Harriman House. It was published in 2020. And The Psychology of Money, which the subtitle is Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness, delves into as the title would indicate, the mental framework behind money and investing and the typical pratfalls or pitfalls that can occur when you're investing. And so who is Morgan House? So
Morgan Housel, I actually had the opportunity of hearing him speak, I think a couple of years ago at a great storyteller, a great presence, but he's a former financial columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And he's now works at a collaborative fund, which is early stage venture capital. He's a good storyteller. And that's what I really liked about this book was the stories to get his messages through. Yeah,
I found it to actually be I don't want to say it's an easy read. That kind of diminishes what his writing style. But I actually found it just user friendly from a reading standpoint. I remember delving into Ray Dalio's book, and I finished it. But boy, oh boy, it was dense. This is not that kind of book. Not to say that Ray Dalio's book, I can't recall the title offhand, is not worth reading. But this was a little bit different.
Yeah, a lot of good lessons. What were your thoughts, Joel?
I loved it. I loved a few things about it. First of all, I loved how he started it, and I loved how he ended it.
Did you read the middle, Joel?
I did read the middle, yeah.
I ran out of time.
But I do like how he constructed each of his chapters. So first of all, the book is quite short. It's, maybe 200 pages. And each chapter covers a principle. And each principle is no more than literally 7, 8, 10 pages or whatnot. So it's very short. And each principle, he brings it to light by introducing a narrative. And he actually even mentions in his book that a story is more appealing than just listening to stats. I think it was in one of the chapters near the end. But he mentions that, stories, they relate to people, they resonate with people much more than, just showing them a bunch of stats, stuff like that. So for example, take Warren Buffett. Reading Warren Buffett's story or learning or let's just say looking into his story would be more beneficial to you than just looking at the stats and the technical maneuvers that Warren Buffett made throughout his career. So that's one thing I loved about it.
Well, and the neat thing about this book, a lot of books are progressive and you have to read chapter 1, then chapter 2 and so on and so forth through to the end. And there's some aspect of this in this book, but you can actually intermittently, as I was reading through it, you can actually jump into chapter 20 independent of chapter 3. Right.
Because like Jalal said, it was covering a different principle. Yeah. Well, what I liked about it too, instead of getting into the technical jargon or strategy of investing, it really focuses on the behavioral aspect. And we talk a lot about that in terms of what makes successful investors. So I really resonated with a lot of the different topics and different things to recognize in your own behavior when it comes to investing. I think he explained it really well.
Well, give us an example.
Well, the one concept was paranoid optimism. And I think that's a really good way to describe myself because I am always paranoid and I'm always looking at the cautious way. I'm not super risky when it comes to investing, but ultimately we know that tough times come, we do believe in humanity can figure it out. So we have some optimism. So I like that concept. I was like, that's a good way to describe it.
Every time I hear the word paranoid, it reminds me of one of my favorite phrases. Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me. Anyway, I digress. But no, I agree. I mean, look, optimism has a bit of a veil around it that you're almost Pollyannish, that you're
your head in the clouds.
Yeah, your head's in the clouds.
A little naive.
You're naive and you're not recognizing that bad things can happen in life or tough periods can happen in life. And but equally paranoia has a stigma around it where basically you're constantly, you're stuck, you're alert, you're always, you have a catastrophe mindset and so forth. I think blending the two gives a very purposeful mix of, hey, I get it. Over time, things are going to be good.
Yeah.
But let's be reasonable and realistic that in the interim, there could be some difficult periods and you need to be ready for them and work them through.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say was your favorite principle of all of them? Was yours the pessimism one, or
I like the paranoid optimism? Oh, what is my favorite?
what about you, Sean? Like, what was your favorite one? Do you think?
Oh, I have
I know they're all great. Like, I won't
There's
deny
so
they're all
many
great, and
great,
they can. What I loved a lot. What I loved.
I did have a favorite part of it.
Really?
Actually, yeah,
Okay.
I did, and there was a concept. I can't remember what chapter it was. It was somewhat in the first, let's say, third of the book, and it was basically the gist of it is no one gives a flying fadoo
Oh,
what you own
Man
or
in the
what
car paradox. Man in the car paradox.
Yeah,
what you drive or what you own.
Yeah.
No one gives a damn.
Well, then that was the concept of people are confused with being wealthy versus being rich.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
And what I found interesting is he worked as he worked as a valet Parker. Morgan worked as a valet Parker.
Yeah.
Easy for me to say. And he saw people pulling up in Ferraris and Lamborghinis and so forth.
Yeah.
He wouldn't even acknowledge
time
the
of the day.
people that are driving. He was just more focused on him being in the car.
Yeah.
So you could have like the greatest house, the greatest
Yeah.
car, the greatest boat. No one's going to care. They just
Yeah.
vision them owning the boat rather than
Right.
you. So it's
Right.
it's not the making of a person
Right.
to own this stuff. It's
Yeah.
more other aspects that are quite obvious, being caring and empathetic and kind and so forth.
Right,
that are
right,
gonna
right.
drive your reputation.
Right. But I just wonder how would that translate to, for example, the image of professionalism? Because I'll give you an example. For example, if I have a house and I called a plumber. Well, if an individual showed up in a Toyota Camry, with no offense to Toyota, but if he showed up in a Camry versus if he showed up in a cube van or a cargo van, with like the arts,
The logo
on
it,
and
yeah.
all that stuff,
Right.
and the tags. I am going to take the second person a little bit more seriously.
Okay,
Right.
that's reasonable. I mean, I don't think. Well, I think what Morgan is suggesting is not that. I mean, obviously, you
Right.
need to be, depending on what profession you're in, you need to basically dress to that profession, and you need to drive an automobile consistent with that profession.
Right.
But what he's suggesting is that, if you think you're gonna, when you could get away with car X and you buy car Y, which is twice as expensive as car X,
Okay.
you're not really materially moving the needle in terms of people's perception of you.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So critiques though. Now and because I know you guys are mentioning, and the only reason I'm bringing this up, this specific critique, is because you guys are saying wealth versus rich, and this is also, I think, in my opinion, in one of his chapters, he mentions, obviously you guys love talking about compounding, right?
Yep.
And he brings up the stat that, what was it, like 90%, Sean, maybe correct me here, 90% of Buffett's net worth was made after he was 65 or something like that?
Oh, way
Or
higher than that.
Probably way higher than that. Okay, let's just say
It was like
95.
99.9%
After
Yeah,
the
something
after
like
the
that.
age of 52.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and while mathematically, and if I'm looking at a table that may be correct, and I don't know, but I'm sure it's correct, or else I highly doubt it would get published. But it begs the question, for me at least, as a 33-year-old, well, what's the point of wealth at that? What's the point of it at that point? Like,
Well, I
if
like
I'm 9 years old, right,
Yeah.
worth, I don't know, 150 billion, and I'm not, the wealth versus rich, and I'm not enjoying my life, or I know obviously enjoyment in life is subjective, but if I'm not spending that kind of money, if I'm not buying the Ferraris and the Lambos or the big houses, I'm not saying that's who I am.
Which Buffett incidentally doesn't. But
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. No, exactly, and he doesn't. But then I ask myself, and this was a question I asked myself when I read the book. It was like, well, what's the point of it all?
So-
See,
so
I like the part that he talked about, though. He's talked about independence, and that will be subjective to everybody else. Like, how much money do you have just to have the independence? To have the independence to say, if I wanted to, I'm going to decide who I work with, when I work with them, the time I spend with them. You just have that flexibility.
right.
And I liked that whole concept, because for everybody that's going to be different. And it's not about the stuff and the thing. It's all about just having the flexibility to do that. That's true wealth, is having that freedom, if you will, to do that.
And I think to go back to the Buffett example, I mean, he talks about Buffett really enjoying investing from the age of 10.
Right.
and doing it all the way through his life. So it's not like when Buffett gets up for work or has ever gotten up to work, he's not like he's going to the salt mines and working these like, bludgeoning 15-hour days. He loves what he does.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't, I can imagine, I can't prove it, but I don't think he was sitting on a high school football field slinging footballs around. I don't think he was doing that. Right?
I love the images
We
you
might
draw.
be surprised.
I just don't think, he might have been, but I think he was more focused. He's always been an investment propeller head, which is, that's his gift.
Yeah.
And so this is what he enjoys. He doesn't like, I don't imagine, although by the way, he is a Nebraska Huskies or Huskers, or Cornhuskers football fan. I digress. But he doesn't, I don't think he goes and golfs a lot or anything like that. This is what he enjoys
just loves
doing.
what he's doing.
Yeah.
So I can't, so that's the difference. I mean, so to put it in the context of an average person, if you love doing what you're doing, why stop?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm not saying I'm not suggesting that Warren Buffett should like quit or retire or whatnot. He's obviously amazing at what he does.
But the question is, can he retire?
Of course he can.
Right.
Yeah.
If he can't retire, then I don't think anybody has any chance of retiring.
But he's been able to do that since, a very young age, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
I think he was worth, in today's dollars, $9 million US by the age of 30.
9 million US. Okay.
He was a millionaire by age 30.
Yeah.
And that was way back years ago, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so what I like a lot about these principles, by the way, one thing I wanted to bring up is that they can actually be related to even other parts of life. Like even if you take out the financial aspect of it, I know it's called the psychology of money.
Yeah.
But what I loved a lot about Housel's writing is how he structured the principles, or even how he worded the principles in a way where you can totally see this concept being applied to other areas of life. An example of that is his chapter 9, wealth is what you don't see.
Yes.
Well, when I read that, I even remembered, I thought about social media, right? Like even individuals, for instance, showing, portraying images of like their life is great, life is awesome, and they're living the best life of the best life that they can. But what I noticed is that also you don't know what's going on, obviously behind closed doors. You don't know the problems that people are facing. This is not this is not a therapy session. I'm not suggesting it is, but I just wanted to bring about that how these principles that he highlighted, can be translated
Applied
to other words of
just
life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why it was the first book I think, I'm glad it was one of the first books we decided to kick off our series on, because it is a good book to read.
Yeah.
It is a good book to read. Even if you're not interested in investing, even if you're not interested in, money growth or whatever it is, it's still a great book to read to even apply in other areas of your life.
Well, it makes you reflect, because one of the other things he talks about that we often talk about is your relationship with money is dependent largely on your upbringing.
Yeah.
And he went into talking about people's backgrounds, and, somebody that's gone through a depression might have a very different relationship than somebody that perhaps was in the 80s. So it's bringing up those past history. And I think it just makes you kind of think about your own experience. And it's like, oh yeah, that probably does shape how I interact with money. So I like the way he, went back and referred to those different experiences that people went through.
Yeah. It's a rare person, I think, that would read this book and not find something that applies to them. There are some books that folks read, including myself, where it's like, okay, this does not apply to me. My wife one time recommended a book, written by Oprah Winfrey, and I read a little bit of it, and that's about as far as it went, right? But this book actually applied, throughout the whole piece. I mean, the other interesting thing, and I mean, look, we saw this probably last year, right? They talked about, using history as a concrete guide for the future, and a lot of people like to do that. I mean, historians often say, what's written in the future has been guided by the past, and I don't know if that's true. And he quotes a Stanford professor, Scott Sagan is his name, and Scott, I really like this quote: "Things that have never happened before happen all the time."
Yeah.
And that
I think it was in his chapter 12 surprise. Yeah.
I mean, and that I found that interesting, which led to kind of the concept around investing as a practice of managing odds versus certainties. Right.
So, sorry, can you repeat that again? What did he say again?
So it talks about investing from the perspective of
managing odds.
Okay. In other words, you can be right for the wrong reasons in the short run. That you can have the preponderance of information. You can take all the time to assess it. You can say, okay, based on what I'm seeing, this makes sense to engage in this way. But something could come out of left field that you could not have anticipated.
Right. Yeah. Right.
That can, in the short run, derail your thesis and make you look pretty silly.
Right.
And that's where, he talked about, we like to talk about being rational versus reasonable.
Yeah, I liked that concept. That was a big
one of the
one.
things he talked about is, in investing mantras, you're often told, do not fall in love with your investments. Do not fall in love with what you're doing.
Yeah.
He argues actually that may or may not be a bad thing, because if you actually love the companies that you own and you understand them and you're convicted to them or convicted to stand by them, you're less likely to abandon the strategy at the worst possible time,
right?
And allow compounding over years and years and years to still hold.
But your feelings will still have to be based on some level of reality. Like, if I love Blockbuster or BlackBerry, I shouldn't stay in it just because I loved it.
Yeah,
well,
you know what I mean?
Well, that speaks to Pollyanna versus some pragmatism in your view, right?
No. I wouldn't say it's Pollyanna. I'd say it's like, listen, I think you and I were talking about this yesterday, Amy. If you had asked me, like, I know Sean, yourself, and a few other individuals have always said, invest in good companies. But if you had asked me in 05, 06, is Blockbuster or BlackBerry a good company? Anyone would say, hell yeah, they're great companies.
Right.
But then if you look at over the next 10 years of that, well, they were definitely not great companies. And if you look at Blockbuster, they were definitely not a good company, even especially in the sense that when they saw that a lot of people or society in general, with the advancement of the internet, they're moving towards online streaming. They had infrastructure, they had licenses, they had license to sell a lot of movies, they had licenses, they had money, they had the infrastructure and the structure to actually even pursue a streaming service.
Right.
Yet they didn't.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And we all know what happened at Blockbuster. Same with BlackBerry. I know if maybe in one of the first few episodes, you said that Warren Buffett would look around, see, well, everybody's holding a Coca-Cola in his hand. Everybody's holding this in his hand. Let's buy Coca-Cola or whatnot. Well, in 04, 05, 06, 07, everybody's holding a BlackBerry in their hand, right? So it's not, I guess what I'm trying to say is finding that love, even if you love something, right? It still has to be based on rational thought and your analysis of society or of the market.
Well, and I think Housel touches on that. He says that if you look over the span of time, not years but decades, he brings up exactly what you're talking about, which is some 60% of companies that were around 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago are not in existence today.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
Or they're dramatically different. So
Yeah.
of course you have to be mindful of that, right?
Right.
And he also talks about luck. Right. So if we talk
his
about
second chapter, which is what I love that he put luck as a second chapter.
So he talks about luck. So if we talk about Buffett, we can talk about a whole bunch of people who are successful investors. But if you actually look at the percentage of holdings that get them to that point, sometimes it's often a lot of luck.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's not everybody's going to be lucky all the time. And so recognizing, and then he gave a good example of Bill Gates.
Yeah.
He happened, obviously he came from a good family and they had resources, but I didn't know this actually. He was at one of the schools that happened to have the first computer.
Yep.
Yeah, him and Paul Allen.
So how lucky is that? He got exposure to that at such a young age and got into
And
it.
what I absolutely
pretty darn
loved
lucky.
in that same chapter was how their friend, I think it was Keith.
Yeah.
So he was also, was it Keith? I think.
I think
if I'm
so.
not mistaken.
Yeah, I think so.
He was with them, but then just happened that Keith passed away in a mountaineering accident.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? So that just show luck. Now, is it dangerous to go mountaineering? Yes. Is it risky? Yes. But you're not going to stop yourself from doing what you love. But it just so happened that he didn't have the luck that Gates and Allen had.
That's right.
So I like that he pointed that out because it's sometimes you can get caught up in looking at this, and sometimes they had a lucky break and things worked out really well.
Right.
But at the same time, sometimes you can be lucky, but you can lose it too. So it's keeping that all in balance.
I think the other interesting thing you talked about, which we've talked about this privately, and I know I've talked about this with my friends over the years, is what does wealth mean? And we already addressed the material side of it, which is kind of somewhat immaterial when you think about it over time.
Yep.
But what is the most valuable thing you have, and what's the most depleting asset you have in your life? Well, it's time.
Time.
Right? And that's what building assets over time gives you is more control of your time.
Yeah.
Which I felt was interesting.
And I think it is shown through a lot of research that the more time you can control in your life, the happier, the more satisfied you are with your life. Do you guys have anything else? I have one more thing that I wanted to say. It's natural for humans to compare, to compare their lives with others, to compare their successes or their failures with others and all that stuff. But one thing I loved where he mentioned in chapter 6 called Tails You Win, is that you cannot take the extreme scenarios of other people's successes
Yes.
and compare it to yours.
True.
Outliers are so extreme that even in statistics, most of the times they remove these outliers. Like they don't look at it on a bell curve,
Right,
right?
right.
True.
So, and you guys obviously have much more experience client facing than me in this industry, but I'm sure you guys see it all the time where, individuals compare themselves to
It's a common
to
question we
others.
get is how much are other people spending in
Yeah,
retirement? Like,
you
am
know.
I too low? Am I too high? Am I,
Yeah.
where do I fall within, and
Yeah.
again, it's so subjective because people do many different things and some things cost more than others.
It speaks to
So,
the concept of enough.
yeah.
What's
never
enough,
enough.
What's enough?
whatever's enough for you is enough for you.
Yeah.
Right. And the one interesting thing you talked about was is I think it was under the Tales, the chapter you referenced, Tails You Win.
Yeah.
I think over the last, let's say 150 years, 15 billion people have been born, onto this earth.
Yeah.
But there's like 7 people.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That really changed the direction
Yeah.
of history for good or for bad. And,
Right.
and, it doesn't take a
Yeah.
whole leap of logic to think of who those people are. Like
Right.
Joseph Stalin,
Right.
Adolf
Yeah.
Hitler, Bill Gates. I mean, there's a few others.
For
And,
sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's not an exhaustive list, but
Yeah.
the number is very, very small relative to the total number of people that have been born.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing, and then I'm
Yeah.
done in terms
Yeah,
of my
yeah.
observations, was again compounding comes up over and over and over.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah.
And the message I
Your
got.
favorite compounding.
Well,
It is my favorite, but it's such
Both
a
your
and he
favorites.
acknowledges that
I don't
it's a
write the news.
concept. Well, and
Yeah.
he says it's a concept that's hard for people because you can't just calculate. When I say, if you start early, it's not immediate that you're like, oh, I see the difference, right? So that's why when you say it, it's like,
Well, I
what
think
does
there's
that
two
mean?
nuances to compounding. I think one is start early, obviously,
Right.
But the other thing too is that you can't get overly exuberant or overly despondent in any given short subset of time.
Yeah.
Or in other words, you can't let recency bias, serve as the subscription for what's going to happen in the future. You just can't overweight it
Yeah.
Right.
because there's so much time over the years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that to me, it's really important, especially, in the environment we just went through. And maybe we're going to face it again.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Who knows? All right. Well, Amy, Sean, thanks a lot.
So what do we think? Do we think this is a timeless recommendation? Is something we would recommend?
I would.
I would too.
And not just because it's about money, like I said, but it's also because the values that he tries to bring forth,
Yeah.
and the thought that he tries to bring forth can be applied to other areas of life.
Yeah.
Not just money, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it
Thanks.
doesn't matter if you're 27, 57,
Yeah.
or 67 or
100%.
it's universal.
Yeah.
No, I'd give a thumbs up.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely, for sure. There it is, folks.
All right.
Psychology of Money.
It's Harrison House, published 2020, available on Amazon or at your nearest and favorite bookseller to you.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
guys.